today we are privileged to have Tim Hanstad. Tim Hanstad was still a law student when he first joined Roy Crosterman in his mission to strengthen land rights for the rural poor. Hanstad was instrumental in the formal founding of Landesa, then called the Rural Development Institute, helping it grow from a two-person operation run out of the University of Washington's Law School to a top human rights NGO with more than 150 staff around the world. As Landesa's co-founder and senior advisor, Hanstad serves as a global ambassador to the organization and helps guide conversations about how global efforts on extreme poverty, gender equality, food security, and environmental stewardship can benefit from incorporating a land rights lens. He is a member of the executive leadership team and contributes to Landesa's programs by building the capacity of staff in the field offices. He previously served as Landesa's CEO and president for more than a decade, and during that time elevated both the organization and the issue of land rights tremendously globally. Hanstad's international work experience spans more than 18 countries in Asia, Eastern Europe, Africa, Latin America, and including more than 4 years living in India, where he helped launch and grow Landesa's India program. He has more than 25 years of experience in nonprofit leadership, social entrepreneurship, advocacy, project management, research, training, and writing on land rights and international development. Hanstad is a Skoll Foundation Social Entrepreneur Awardee. And for those who are not familiar with the social entrepreneurship sector, that's kind of like the top thing you can win as a social entrepreneur. He's also a World Economic Forum social entrepreneur, a member of the Clinton Global Initiative, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on Food Security, and closer to home, he's on the Global Washington Board of Directors. He's authored numerous publications, including 1 Billion Rising, Land Law, and the Alleviation of Global Poverty. He's an affiliate associate professor at the University of Washington School of Law. He has a JD from the University of Washington, and more importantly to us, a BA from Seattle Pacific University. Woo-hoo! Yes. And in 2016 was named the SPO Alumnus of the Year. So please join me in welcoming.
Thanks, Mark. And it really is great to be here back on campus. If I look like a little nervous, it's because I think this area of Miller, then known as a Slick when I was here, was where I took an organic chemistry class, like sophomore year. And that brings back some bad memories. I want to get a sense, a little bit more about me. The stuff that Mark said, thank you for the very nice introduction. But that was really just about the work side of me, and there's other sides of me that I think are more important. Let's see if I can get this. There's my family, and I put this here for a couple of reasons. One is because I am more than just what I do for work, just as you are much more than what you do as a student. But I also put this up because I have kids about your age, and I'm hoping that you might be able to help me through the Q&A period of how I can provide guidance to them. And because I'm trying to provide guidance to them, maybe I can also be helpful for you. My oldest, and as you can see, my children, fortunate for them, take much more after their mother than they do me. In fact, I can't tell you how many times people have come up to me when I've been with my kids, when my wife is not there, and said, "Oh, it's so nice that you adopted these kids from India. You know, how old were they when you adopted them?" And I've had that from parents from their school even. But I want to get to know you guys a little bit better. So I know we have different majors represented here. So first of all, are there graduate students? What's the mix between graduate students and undergrads? You all undergrads? All undergrads. Okay, I know we have, I suspect we have some business majors, global development, maybe economics. Who are the global development studies folks? Okay, great. I wish they had that program when I was back in school. I would have jumped on that. Business majors? Economics? A lot of economics. Others? Accounting? No? What are the others? Electrical engineering. Political science. That was one of my majors when I was here, political science and history. Anything else? Mechanical engineering. Fabulous. Okay, another question for you. And you thought I was going to talk to you. Actually, I'm just getting information. What are you looking for in a career? And when I say that, I imagine it's not just one answer. But I'm wondering if you've thought through this and what, is it financial security? Is it doing something that you like? Is it working with people that you like? Is it something else? Anybody, volunteers. And I've been a law school professor. In law school, they teach on the Socratic method, and professors call on you and actually make you stand up when you give the answer. That's not always true.
Do you want a class list?
Yeah, that would be great. I can just point to people knowing it. So volunteers, what is it? One thing, I realize it's not going to be, what are you looking for in a career?
Financial security.
Financial security.
Something that's challenging.
Something that's challenging.
Like a purpose.
A purpose. Tell me more. What do you mean a purpose?
I think it would be great to be able to have the privilege to have a job where I'm actually passionate about it. And there are like financial components as well, but being able to enjoy my work would be great.
Great, thank you. Anything else?
Getting paid for doing what you love.
Getting paid for doing what you love. That is a privilege. And I'm sure all of the faculty members in this room would say they've achieved that, right? You're not so sure. Yeah. Oh, the doing what you love part was very true. Okay. Okay. Maybe we ought to have the administration in here to a little bit more on the first part of that sentence. Well, I have had and it really is a privilege and a huge blessing to be able to work on something that sometimes I pinch myself and I get paid for, because it is something about a purpose. I don't know that I would have been bright enough or kind of self-reflective enough to have answered it that way. But it certainly is purpose-filled. There's a book out there. It's one of the best books I've ever read about what motivates human behavior in the workplace. It's a book by Daniel Pink called Drive. And what Daniel Pink says is that we all are looking for three things in a job or a career. And he starts with the assumption that the material benefits you get from working at least are fair or equal. So that, but once you are getting something that allows you to live materially, people are looking for purpose. And by purpose meaning something bigger than yourself. People are looking for mastery. That is, they want to, whatever they're doing, they generally want to be better at it. And there's this internal drive. And three, people are looking for autonomy. So some aspect of being able to be in control of your work and your workplace and schedule and kind of what you do, and not essentially just being told, or working on a factory line where you're just doing a specific thing. So I wish and pray for that for all of you, that you would find something that does give you some degree of financial security, but gives you purpose, gives you the ability to mastery, to continue building your skills, which, by the way, all this learning that you're doing in school won't stop, or should certainly not stop once you graduate, and then gives you some autonomy. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey and how I got to where I got to. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the issue of global poverty and how it connects to land rights. I understand for those of you who are in the room, you've recently, who are in the, what was the name of your class?
Political and economic development.
Political and Economic Development of Nations. So you've become somewhat familiar with Hernando de Soto, right? And then in the development economics class, you've been learning a little bit about agriculture and about gender. And so these issues will certainly intersect, hopefully, with what you've been learning. And we're going to save some time at the end for Q&A. And I'm going to be asking you some questions too, because I want to learn what you've learned. So my journey. I grew up in Skagit Valley. I'm the grandson of Norwegian immigrants and farmers, and I spent much of my time in the summers growing up, starting when I was 8 years old, working in the fields. And it was through that process of working in the fields that I learned a couple of really important things. One was the value of hard work. And the second, even more importantly than that, was I had the opportunity to work alongside migrant laborers from southern Mexico who were very poor. And I actually grew up in poverty. I mean, we didn't have much materially, but that was more than made up for by the abundance of love and kind of Christian teaching that I got when I grew up, which is much more valuable than anything I could have received materially. But I looked at these families that I was working alongside and said, these people are really in a difficult place. They're either living in their cars or they're living in kind of huts that the farmers themselves had created for them. And yet, something didn't compute because they were working much harder than I was. I could see that their work ethic and the amount of whatever it was we were doing, picking strawberries or blueberries or cucumbers, was they were working much harder than I was, and yet they were much poorer. So that didn't compute for me. The guy who grew up with a kind of a socialized into a Protestant work ethic that you work really hard and that's how you achieve materially in life. And it didn't make sense. That planted a seed in me about issues of social justice, issues of international development. As I got to know some of these kids and would ask them about their situation, and they would talk about what it was like back home, and it was even more challenging than what they were living at here. That they essentially had come to the United States because they saw it as an opportunity, a better opportunity than what they had at home. So even though I grew up in a rural area, fairly insular, these ideas of social justice and international development got planted in me. And as I went through high school, I tried to read as much as I could about these issues. It wasn't until I got to SPU that I really got into them in a more deep way with professors who also connected how Christian faith was involved in these issues, that I really got interested in them. And I decided while I was at the University of Washington, because of some good advice I got from professors who saw these passions, and I started thinking about going to law school. And it was reading, actually doing research for a paper in a history of U.S. foreign policy class here at SPU, that I came across the work of Professor Roy Prosterman, who is a professor at the University of Washington Law School, and had been working on and writing about issues of land rights reform overseas. So I read a couple of his articles as part of this research, and I thought, wow, here's a lawyer out there who's working on these issues, and it seems really cool, and I didn't really know much about land, but it seemed kind of intuitive that it would be important. And so I thought, okay, this seals the deal, I'm going to go to law school. I had a decision to make then about where to go to law school, and that was like decision point number one maybe was whether to go to law school. And frankly, part of it is, when I explain this in hindsight, it all sounds like it was part of a big plan. It wasn't that really at all. I mean, it was much less that. It was kind of, a lot of it was very random. And also the fact that I didn't really have another plan, and so I liked school. I'd done pretty well at school, so, well, I might as well just keep going to school. And then it was like, what school I'm going, what area I'm going to go to. But I did, so I did make some choices that weren't wholly informed. And I look back now and see God's providence in all of those choices kind of leading me along this path, even though it wasn't so incredibly intentional on my part. I had to choose between going to law school on the East Coast or going to the law school at University of Washington, and there was, the logical choice would have gone to some of the options I had on the East Coast. There were more prestigious schools. People said, well, you get a degree from that school and you'll be set for your career, blah, blah, blah. But I kept thinking about Roy Prosterman, thinking like, well, I know there's a guy at this school who's doing something that sounds really cool, and I don't necessarily want to, be working in a downtown law firm. So I chose to go to the University of Washington, and people told me, you made the wrong choice. But I was following kind of my heart and what my passions were that had been about social justice, international development. I then started working with Roy I hunted him down. So this is another thing. I hunted Professor Prosterman down while I was there, because I'm thinking, this is a guy who's doing something really interesting, and I want to learn from him and be a part of it if I can be. And he was advertising for a research assistant, so I got a job with him. And that was, again, most of my law school classmates were looking for jobs at prestigious law firms that paid better and were more kind of a glamorous career. And I had people telling me, oh, you're going to work for this kind of do-gooder professor. I was a bit of an outlier in my class. I started working with Roy then. Let's see if I can do this here. This is a picture of me actually in law school. I had the opportunity to start doing field work with him while I was in law school. So I was going, this is El Salvador. We were doing field work in a conflict zone. We were just posing with that gun, but we had to helicopter into these places with guards who were carrying these guns everywhere we went. So it was all kind of exciting, and now my friends who were at the law firm were thinking, oh, maybe wasn't such a bad decision after all. I then got out of law, or got towards the end of law school. I'd also clerked for a firm, and I actually loved working at the firm, and it was a firm downtown, and they offered me jobs. So then I had I didn't know that I could make a living out of working with the professor, because he was doing this, by the way, in his spare time. He was a full-time professor, and he was just doing this as kind of moonlighting. But he, right near the end of my third year, he got a grant, a $50,000 one-year grant. And he said to me, I could hire you for a year. This will cover your salary and some travel. It won't be a very big salary, but it'll be something. And your travel. And you could work for me for a year, and maybe this donor will re-up and we'll go another year. I don't know. Meanwhile, so I had to choose between that and going down more traditional law path at a law firm, which was financial security, more prestige, much more money, and I took the Roy Prosterman land rights reform path. In part because people at the firm told me, I went and asked, what would you do to one of the young associates? He said, frankly, they'll probably let you back even if you go work somewhere else for a year. So go ahead and do that. I would do it. And I did that, and that was about 30 years ago. What started out to be just a one-year gig. I got in it and realized the power of what Professor Prosterman was doing and never turned back. This is a picture, again, about 30 years ago, doing field work in China. Much of the work that we were doing was doing field work, doing a legal review of the countries where we were looking at landowners. Let me back up a step and tell you just a quick word about Landesa. What Landesa is about helping to address some of the biggest global challenges on the earth, and primarily that is poverty. And I'm going to talk about poverty today, but it's also actually about other things like conflict and climate change and gender equality. Roy started this work back in the 60s, and he was very, very interested in these issues of poverty and conflict and where they intersect. And what he recognized studying things is that most of the poorest people on the planet live in rural areas. And they live in rural areas where land is the most important asset. By the way, it's still true today. Almost 2/3 to 3/4 of the world's poorest people live in rural areas. And that's different than our kind of most people's notions in the global north about what poverty is like. Because you think of poverty, and our images of them are often of that concentrated poverty in the slums, in urban areas. And that's very real and very problematic. But still, the largest number of poor people on the planet are in rural areas. Okay, and why are they poor? And why does poverty coexist with conflict in a lot of places? And Roy started looking at those things and said, land seems to be at the center of this in many ways. Land is the most important asset for because most people who live in rural areas rely on a land-based livelihood. That is, they essentially rely on land to live. And many of those people actually don't have land or don't have secure rights to land. And it's that call for land or desire to want land becomes opportunity. So Roy's thinking was, well, how do we address that? And it wasn't about, he wanted to think about it in a big way. How do you address it from a system level? Because certainly you could go into one household at a time and say, how can I get you land? How can I get you land? How can I make sure the land that you're farming right now that you don't have title to, how can I help you get title? And you could do that one person at a time, one household at a time, maybe one village at a time, and that would be really important work and is important work. But Roy kept asking the why question. He says, why don't these people have land, or why don't they have secure rights to land? I'm going to get this off that picture. And it was asking that why question, and when that got answered, he says, okay, why that? Why that? Why that? And you start realizing that these issues are system issues, that you keep going upstream. And why should we keep going upstream? A little bit about this issue of poverty. By the way, at the World Economic Forum, this is a big meeting that happens in Davos and then a number of regional places every year. They often do polls of these experts from around the world who come from politics, from business, from the nonprofit sector on what are the most important global challenges. And virtually every year, global poverty comes up as the #1 challenge. This is from people including in business. Why is it an important challenge? You just look at the numbers. We have almost 3 billion people around the world who make their living on less than $2 a day. I mean, that just seems ridiculous. It does to me anyway. That still in this age of affluence, when so many people have so many, there's still so many left behind. By the way, on the poverty issue, people are often mistaken about where we're at in terms of progress on poverty. And I want to take a quick poll among you. How many of you think that in the last 10 years, the number of, let's go last 20 years, the number of poor people in the world has, I'm going to ask you whether it's increased, decreased, or stayed about the same. So, increased. Raise your hand if you think it's increased. Decreased. Stayed about the same. Okay, the number of poor people in the world has decreased. we've made more progress on addressing poverty in the last 30 years than has been made in the history of humankind. So that's a good part of the story. We are, I would say we are, the planet is making significant progress on bringing people up out of poverty. That said, it's still a big problem, and there's still a lot of ways to go. But I mentioned that we've made lots of progress because that part often gets lost in the story, particularly people who are out there trying to raise money about how bad things are. They don't want to tell you good parts of the story. But it's important to know the good parts of the story because we need to learn from what's been successful. The effects of poverty, and this is the tougher part of it. It's, these are all big numbers. Poverty is essentially the cause of hunger. There's still 850 million people on the planet who are chronically hungry. That means go to bed hungry most nights. But it's not just the going hungry. It's being malnourished, and it's about malnourishment leading to death. That is, most people don't die from, hunger doesn't kill people from starvation as much as it does malnutrition. 50,000 deaths a day due to poverty. So, do the math. That means if we're in this room, that's what, 2,000 people an hour? So at the time we're meeting here, there are people around the world dying of poverty. So this is an urgent problem. It's not just a big problem, it's an urgent problem. And we're making some progress on it, but we need to make a lot more. It, by the way, is also a huge drag on global growth. For those of you, well, most of you are in, I guess, one of those two classes, and you're learning a lot about growth, and maybe growth and inequality, and what that mix is. I think the evidence is pretty strong that that poverty itself slows down growth. That it's not an issue just of, do we need to speed up economic growth to solve poverty, or do we need to solve poverty to speed up economic growth? There's both issues there. We can't solve all problems. We can't solve the poverty problem without economic growth. Not sustainably. So there are those who argue, well, it's not about growth. Let's not talk about growth. Let's talk about just lifting people out of poverty and doing kind of direct interventions to help them lift out of poverty. And then there's other people who would say, no. All we got to do is focus on broad growth. Right? If we can get growth up to 5% a year, or 6% or 7% a year around the globe, it would take care of poverty by itself. I'm telling you, neither one of those is true, at least from what I have studied over the years and seen over the years. You need both. You need both broad-based growth, and you need targeted interventions for the poor. And if you focus only on growth, you won't get it. If you focus only on those targeted interventions, you won't get it. Poverty is also a big driver of conflict around the world. So we're not going to address large-scale conflict issues around the globe without addressing poverty. It's going to take more than just addressing poverty, but if we do it, you won't be able to address the conflict problems without poverty. So where are the poorest people, and what are the trends? I've already covered some of this. 3/4 in rural areas. About 90 to 95% is in these three regions: Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and East Asia. People think that East Asia has made it. There's been more progress. Most of that progress around poverty has been in East Asia, but there's still significant numbers just because, even though the percentage is lower. So this, I've got a pointer here. So that's the percentage of the population in Sub-Saharan Africa. And that's the total number. These figures are a few years out of date. So you can see, even though the percentage in East Asia is lower, you still have 825 million. The largest number of poor people on the planet is still in South Asia. The progress that we're seeing is fastest here. Next fastest here, slowest so far here, at least in recent years. So these proportions are going to change. You'll see, I think, over the next 10 and 20 years, the relative proportion of people in poverty living in Sub-Saharan Africa will be will increase. Okay, so I talked about this, but really, when I think about poverty, when I think about those Mexican migrant kids that I was working with when I was 8, 10, 12 years old, I think it's so much about opportunity. It's my experience working around the world, traveling around the world, is that if you think about innovation, intelligence, kind of drive, you find it everywhere in the world. It doesn't matter where you go. I think intelligence and innovation and drive are fairly equally distributed around the world. What's not equally distributed? Opportunity. And so when I think about addressing poverty, I think about how do we expand opportunity? Because opportunity is not very inclusive. I'm sure your own life experience will show you that some people just have better access to opportunities. And it is by historical accident that many of you, for me, was born in a country or a place where I had much more opportunity than other people in the world. If we could distribute opportunity around the world better, we would deal with the poverty question. And for the poorest people on the planet, that opportunity is often centered around land. Because land becomes that source of food, source of income, source of wealth, source of power, source of access to government services. It's a place where you construct your home, your habitation. So that is why I work on land issues and why I didn't know all of this when I started. I just saw that this Professor Prostron was doing something really interesting, and so I went to essentially join him in it. And when I started learning more and more, it resonated with my background too. What I realized is that I kept thinking about those children in Skagit Valley. Actually, as I learned more about my grandparents' experience, that resonated as well. My grandfather grew up in Norway, working as a farm laborer, and he fell in love with my grandmother, wanted to marry her. Her parents were landowning farmers. He was a farm laborer. He didn't own any land. He went and asked for her hand in marriage. They said, no, you basically don't have any economic future. You identify an economic future for yourself and come back and ask us. So he was determined, I'm going to save up money and buy some land because then I'll be able to marry this woman. He's tried to save up money for a long time. He kept a diary which tells this story. He saved up money and realized after some time he's not going to be able to save up enough to buy land. So he comes up with Plan B. Plan B is, I'm going to move to America because I know this is a land of opportunity. I can get a job there, blah, blah, blah. So he goes back to my great-grandparents and says, I found a place. It's called Minnesota. Got some friends who are going to move there, and they've got a job, and I'm going to go with them. And they said, okay, great. You can marry our daughter, but you're going to establish yourself first there in the United States. So he moved to the United States kind of basically because he couldn't get land. I can tell you, working in India, China, Bangladesh, Indonesia, El Salvador, places around the world, how some variant of that story happens in so many places. And it's about land being opportunity. There is a lot of evidence out there in the economic literature and the social science literature about how secure land rights actually does make a difference for people. Why? Why would having secure land rights make a difference for people? I've already touched on some of them, but why? Oh, here.
When you have land rights, you're more inclined to want to increase the value of your land.
Increase the value of your land. So it's sometimes said nobody ever washes a rented car. And it's some variant of that. If you, some of you are living, if you're living in a rented house, you're not going to be making long-term major improvements on it. They're going to increase the value of the house. So why else?
You can use it as collateral for loans.
You can use it as a collateral for loans. So increases your access to credit. And by the way, it's not just, it increases your access to credit even apart from it being able to use it as collateral. That's what a lot of studies would show. It's just because the person who's going to loan money, whether it's an institution or a person, knows where to find you. Anything else?
Your ability to keep what you produce increases.
Sorry?
Your ability to keep what you produce increases.
Your ability to keep what you produce increases.
You can trade. You can create trade.
Trade through trading the land? Yeah. Yeah. So it gives you access to markets. And part of that access to markets, by the way, if you own land, it creates a sense of resiliency. Resiliency is incredibly important for anybody, but particularly for getting out of poverty. Resiliency means your ability to respond to bad things that happen in your life, which economists often call shocks. So what would a shock be? A shock would be drought. A shock would be illness or death in the family. A shock could be, by the way, climate change impacts can be a shock. Unfortunately, in many places of the world, having a child who's a girl is a shock. Why is that? Why would having a girl be a shock in the sense of having an economic impact on the family?
Depending on, I guess, if it's like if land is passed down through, like from father to son, essentially, like if they can't own land and they end up living with their future spouse, then the household might not see them as like a future investment in it.
Right. Well, and that's part of it. So for many, in many parts of the world, first of all, when you have a girl child, that girl child is a temporary resident in your household. And eventually, in most parts of the world, particularly in rural areas, we have what's called a patrilocal system of marriage. Patrilocal system of marriage means that when your girl children marry out, they move to where their in-laws live. And typically that's not in the same village where you are. So you're moving out. So I'm going to do the Roy Prosterman thing. Why is that? How does that patrilocal system of marriage, how did it even start?
Often in Eastern cultures, the son of the family becomes the head of the household after his father passes away or after he reaches a certain age. And so he stays in his household, not only marries a woman, takes care of his parents until they pass away and takes care of the land.
Right. So that's it. And there's one thing about land that makes it different from virtually every other asset. What is that? You can't move it. So if you're going to inherit the land or you're going to take care of the land, that means you're going to stay where you're at. This whole idea of patrilocal system of marriage is embedded in this gender injustice that only men inherit land. Anyway, so it's all there's gender injustice embedded in our systems. How many of you have read Jane Austen novels? What's a common theme in at least some of her famous novels? It's about marrying off daughters. Why? Downton Abbey. How many of you watched Downton Abbey? all about gender and justice, folks, and it all comes down to land and why it's only men who are inheriting the real estate and the land. Anyway, the point being is that there are systemic injustices in the world, and I don't know how I got off on the gender track kind of earlier than I thought I would, but this is something that if there's nothing else you take away from this, is asking these questions, why? Why? Why do we have a patrilocal system of marriage? Why is it that we have this idea that only men or boy children can inherit land or own land, or at least even if they aren't the only ones that inherit it, they're the ones who control it? Why do we have these? And what are the implications of that? I'm not going to go over these other ones, but just know that there's a lot of other economic evidence out there about when you have secure land rights, your wealth goes up. By the way, titling land in itself, even if you're sitting on land that you've been using for a generation, once you get title to it, the value of the land goes up because it becomes more valuable to other people because it's easier to sell. There's some really interesting studies that show that when people get secure land rights compared to those who don't have secure land rights who are in the same situation, this is a kind of a natural experiment, almost a natural randomized control trial, teenage pregnancy was reduced by half. Why? Why would that be? Well, the best explanation I can tell you is that when people get secure land rights, they start getting hope in their future. Their planning horizon, their time horizon expands. And there's a lot of fancy economic ways to try to measure that in terms of their attitudes and whether you believe in fate, that is, whether I'm in control of my economic destiny or I'm not in control of my economic destiny, and how that changes your behavior. But it all comes down to hope. It all comes down to hope in the future. And when you have hope in the future, you'll start making different types of decisions than if you don't have hope in the future. That's where the teenage pregnancy thing comes from. Now, giving secure rights to land makes a lot of difference, and most of the economic literature looks at it from a household basis, like what are the differences to the household. But and a lot of good things happen when you get secure legal rights to land to a household. But it matters also who in the household shares in those rights. So when women share in those rights, additional good things happen. Now, something more about this gender issue, which I tell you, I'm fascinated by this because it's something I felt like, and I'll just be real here, growing up in an evangelical Christian tradition, at least at the time I was a kid in the 60s, I got very, very little of this. In fact, I think it was skewed in many ways that were negative. But I am increasingly convinced that focusing on the economic empowerment of women and girls is one of the most important things we can do to make this planet better. Increasingly convinced. Again, the economic literature, so you guys have, those of you who are in the development economics course, you've recently, I've been told, covered some gender topics. What's one thing you've learned about it that was maybe new? Why is this issue of gender important to development economics? Any brave soul?
I thought it was interesting how education and children's health all went up with women's assets. That is maybe something that if you're not educated in that topic, you don't realize. You assume that men will also care for the family.
Yeah. There's a lot of studies out there that compare how women spend money or and how men spend money. So like if women has control over the household income, how that changes how family income is spent. It's generally, I mean, if I could sum up the literature, it's something like the more women have control over the expenditure of family income, the higher amount of that income will be spent for the welfare, education, nutrition of children. That seems important. And it's also, by the way, a kind of a sad commentary maybe on men. But I don't, on that, by the way, I think it's really important, and this is to the men in the room, that we recognize that empowering women does not mean disempowering men. Empowering women empowers families, empowers societies, and empowers all of us. And as soon as we as men start seeing empowering women and girls as a zero-sum game, that is, whatever they gain, they took it from us, or it means something, we are losing something, we are going to be in a bad situation. So I'm telling you, it can be a growing pie. It is not a zero-sum game. And even if it was a zero-sum game, I fully believe that it's up to us as men to do the right thing and pursue gender equality. Because frankly, the biggest systemic obstacle for gender equality in the world is men. It's about men's decision-making power at the family level, at the business level, at the political level, and that can be a challenging thing, and people, I know a lot of men get defensive about it, but it actually should be an empowering thing, because actually men have the power to change this. Gender issues are not women's issues. Gender issues are societal issues. And until we get more men being leaders around these issues of gender, we're not going to make the progress that we need to make. Sorry, that was a bit of a sideline, but an important sideline. So I'm going to try to wrap up quickly here, but I want to talk a bit about how does Landesa do what we do. So I told you we work on the system side of it, and it's not just about giving one household or one village at a time. So what Landesa's approach, and it's rooted in back what Roy did from the very beginning, was keep asking the why questions, or as I would say, keep going upstream and figuring out what's causing these things. And if you look at it, what's causing the problems of lack of opportunity around lack of land ownership around the world, it comes down to two broad issues. One is the laws and policies are bad, or are not, another way of put it, it's not an appropriate policy enabling environment. But essentially policies and laws are insufficient. They're bad. It's, I think it can be summed up best this way. If you want to change the world, you've got to change the rules. If you want to change the world, you've got to change the rules. And this is one of the things where the rules need to be changed. Now, changing those laws and policies by itself is not sufficient. That is, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You also need to look at how are those laws and policies going to get implemented. So what Landesa does is ultimately we're trying to change and implement the laws in certain focus countries where some of the biggest parts of the problem exist. So we do that in India. We do that currently. We've worked in more than 50 countries around the world, and we've partnered with governments on reforms that have provided secure legal land rights to over 130 million families. So that is a big number, but I would say two things about it. One is it shows the power of the leverage of law and policy. And when you change law and policy, you can change things at scale. But the second part of it is, it's a big number, but the number of people still living in poverty who rely on land for their livelihoods is many, many times that. So there's so much more work that needs to be done. We start doing this work with research. So this social science desk research, social science field research is critically important to making the changes. It's about understanding. It's about learning. What are the problems that are affecting this country, this family? And based on that research and against our comparative background in more than 50 countries, we then come up with, here are a number of policy steps that country A, whatever the country it is we're working in, could take, that we think needs to be taken. We then, that's the design part, is develop and review the proposed changes to laws. And that involves working with a lot of actors within the country. So we hold policy workshops where we invite other researchers from that country, other NGOs, government officials, sometimes businesses, to provide input and engage in these discussions like, what do you think about these recommendations? Once we get a set of recommendations that we think are solid, we go into more of an advocacy mode. And the advocacy is about educating public officials specifically about these choices, but it's also about understanding what those policymakers want to do in the country and trying to align it with their agenda. If and when those countries adopt the laws or policies that we have promoted along with others, we then work with the government to implement them. And that is just the step that we do in country after country after country.
Most of the
Whoops. This is a 5-minute video, and then we're going to wrap up quickly after that. But it shows you an example of Landesa's approach in one country and what some of the impacts were.
Most of the world's poorest families share two traits. They rely on agriculture to survive, and they don't own the land they farm. Combined, these traits contribute to a cycle of poverty that can be nearly impossible to overcome. But if these farming families are given title to a plot of land, they gain a powerful tool to break that cycle. When a family has legal control over their land, they invest their money and their labor to improve the land, their harvests, and their future. This Rwandan village offers just one example of what happens when Landesa partners with governments to give families titles to their land.
twarishimye kuko hari abadamu benshi byarengeye kubera ko icyangombwa cyanditsweho umugore n'umugabo ntabwo bagiha umugabo umudamu adahari ubwo rero kuvuga ngo abadamu twagize agaciro ku butaka ubuhake dufite imiryango rwose umudendezo n'amahoro n'umutekano nta kibazo dufite.
byarabitse kubera ko gutora abanyeshuri bashobora kwiga nta kibazo iyo ari nijoro.
rero tubona ibyangombwa by'ubutaka twikweza n'ayo mafumbire kubera kugira ikintu amara twabimariraga mu gasozi turi gusangira n'inyoni ariko ntitureza tugahunika tugahungura byinshi tugashyira mu nzu. umunyeshuri undi aradupfundikanya ukatwongera ukagira umunyeshuri ni ukugaho n'abantu babizi inkweto mwadutegeka zo kuwambara umwana akaba n'udukweto akabana kenda keza.
nari mfite icyangombwa cy'ubutaka harimo n'ukuye wambaye amafaranga y'inguzanyo muri banki.
ikindi kandi byakomeje kungura umuryango nta manza ubuze ikibazo. ni ukuvuga ngo ahari imbere wasanga abantu bari gufata ibintu by'amasambu bari kubura nta ngo ubu byaragabanutse kubera ikibazo cya ziriya mpapuro mpamo z'ubutaka.
ubuzima bwanjye cyarabafashije cyane ukurikije ukuntu nasigaye aho nashakiye gata umutwe ariko ntacyo barwaye ariko ikibazo cy'ubutaka cyaraje biramfasha nkurikije gahunda twakuraga mu manama bari kutwigisha bati bagiye kubarura ubutaka.
Over the last 4 decades, Landesa has partnered with governments in more than 40 countries to help bring secure land rights to more than 100 million families. A simple piece of paper creates a durable foundation for increasing food production, promoting education, owning livestock, obtaining electricity, improving women's rights, gaining security, and reducing conflict.
njyewe nitwa Kimaniza Konsiliya, ikibazo cyanjye cy'ubutaka nahawe nta muntu n'umwe ushobora gukura ubutaka bwacu. Mfite icyangombwa cy'ubutaka, ubutaka ni ubwacu, njye n'umutware wanjye, ubutaka bwatugiriye akamaro kuko bumaze kuduteza intambwe. Mfite icyangombwa cy'ubutaka bwanjye kandi rero ubwo butaka bwanjye bumfitiye akamaro kanini mu buzima bwanjye.
For nearly a decade, Landesa partnered with the government of Rwanda, helping to draft new land laws and design and implement a titling program and community education projects. Now, Rwandan farmers, especially women, have a deeper understanding of their land rights and titles to document those rights. Today, the government of Rwanda says hundreds of thousands of farmers across the country have land that they can safely call their own. How many more families, villages, and countries will be transformed by securing land rights?
So, a couple of last comments on social entrepreneurship. And as Mark said in the introduction, first of all, I didn't know what a social entrepreneur was. I don't think the term was even used when I was your age. So the fact that I was later got awards for being a leading social entrepreneur was kind of, I would have thought, what the heck even is that if I were you and I was sitting there. But so I want to give you just a few quick comments on social entrepreneurship. By the way, I had the privilege of being a judge for your social venture plan competition, is that what you call it? Last week. I was so impressed. How many of you participated in that? Good for you. You got, that was fabulous. I mean, the 25 entrants, I think. I mean, all of them impressive. It was a very, very difficult job to select. But social entrepreneurs, simply put, if you think about social entrepreneurs, are about starting something that's going to have social impact, right? I mean, there's a longer definition here, but it's doing it in an entrepreneurial style like a business entrepreneur would. But I think this binary, the separation between I'm a business entrepreneur, I'm a social entrepreneur, is really a false binary. It's much more like a continuum. It doesn't matter if you're a nonprofit organization or you're a for-profit corporation. I would maybe provocatively assert that every entity like that is about a financial bottom line and about some type of social bottom line, right? And it's just the mix of where you draw it, or the legal entity in which you're in is like what that legal entity gives you advantages or tells you have to do certain things. But so I mention that because I think there's a lot of different ways you can set up a social entrepreneur organization. And here's, the Skoll Foundation uses these three categories. They're not the only way to categorize it. One is the leveraged nonprofit. This is the more traditional nonprofit that uses traditional revenue sources for nonprofits, that is donations. And then there's the hybrid nonprofit. So that's an organization that's set up legally as a nonprofit, but has what's called earned income to help and the earned income can be anywhere from 95% to 5% of the organization. And then there's a social business venture. which is set up in a for-profit way. These categories are actually somewhat problematic because they still use that binary of for-profit and non-profit. How many of you know about B corporations? If you don't know about B corporations, learn about them. Because it is essentially a way of thinking about how do you find a legal entity that's in the middle of those, that has as its responsibility both social impact and financial return, and the mix of those. And then just a few quick lessons, then I'm going to stop for Q&As. If you're interested in being a social entrepreneur, it's really important, I think it's important that, that you figure out what your purpose and passion are before you do it. People, I was in Oxford at the business school where they have a center for social entrepreneurship, and that students come up to me and say, I want to be a social entrepreneur. And I said, that's the wrong way to go about it. It's not, I want to be a social entrepreneur, like that's a career choice. It's about, do you have a purpose and a passion around creating social impact around a particular problem in the world? Do you have that? Identify what it is, and then figure out how you're going to work on it. And once you go down working on that way, you may figure out that you'll become a social entrepreneur. But it's not a social entrepreneur that's like a career choice. That's my bias. So it's about figuring out inside what you want to do and then learning as much as you can about that problem. Understand and learn from the landscape. Whatever problem you pick, I can guarantee you won't be the first person that has worked on it. There's so much to learn from other people who are out there doing it. Consider starting with others who are already doing the work rather than starting something new. This is, again, another bit of a pet peeve of mine, is people just want to go out, oh, I've got this idea, I'm going to start something. And that can be it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not the first place I would go. First place I would go is figuring out who's already doing work, and I can learn a ton from them. And maybe I join them and work with them, and then maybe I will start my own thing later on. But it's like, it's like every person coming out of seminary and say, I've got to start my own church. I've got to start my own church, And you have all these little churches going on, and it's not the ideal way of organizing things. Identify metrics for success. Metrics are really super important because metrics will how do you know you're having progress? You have to set metrics. The reason for-profit organizations, I think, are easier to run is because the metrics, one reason, the metrics are pretty simple in terms of the financial return, right? You can measure how much money's going in, how much money you're spending. When you're talking about social impact, it's much more difficult to measure. You have to be much more innovative and careful and pure in your methodology. And then if you're talking about balancing financial returns with social returns, how do you even do that unless you have some way of measuring the social return, right? And then, because even when you identify a way to measure it, if it's number of families that got title, but we also have to, obviously at Landesa, make money to help us do that, we have to compare what is the cost of getting that person title compared to that. Until you identify those trade-offs, or you cannot identify those trade-offs until you get to the metrics. Be ambitious. Begin with an ambitious end in mind. What is the end? For those of you who haven't read the Stephen Covey book, I think it is, the 7 Habits book, one of the 7 habits is start with the end in mind. And that is really crucial. By the way, I think all of those habits are good. So if you haven't read the book, take a quick look at it. And follow your purpose and passion, not society's conventional expectations. That is key. As I said earlier, you need to figure out what your purpose and passion is. You need to spend time with God, with your friends, with others, to figure out what that is. And be sure about what it is you want to do in life. Society will tell you a lot of different things, or you get socialized into thinking, this is the path you should go because this is what society expects of me. And that may not be a bad thing, but check it. Check it. Don't just kind of swim along following society's expectations. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I've gone too long. And open it up for questions about anything I've talked about or anything else you want to ask about? Oh, sorry, right there.
What types of research do you actually do? So do you do like preliminary research on previous literature done in land rights openings and then do case studies in the areas with which you wish to implement some of those policy changes?
Yeah, so all of the above. So we do lit summaries, we do legal research, we do case studies. We usually start, in terms of the field research, we usually start out with qualitative research to identify, kind of do some issue spotting, and then based on results from the qualitative research, we go into more quantitative household surveys. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's like all of the above and mixed methods.
Okay, I have another question that's kind of unrelated to that one. So in the class on the political and economic development of nations, we read the DeSoto book, and it kind of talked about the importance of endogenous social contracts being applied to the land rights in particular communities. What kind of dialogue do you do with those communities in order to come up with policy suggestions for the governments?
Yeah. So, that social contract, one way of thinking about it is that in order for rights to land to be good, they have to be both legally legitimate and socially legitimate. And the socially legitimate part is the part about the social contract you're talking about. Figuring out what is socially legitimate is one of the aims of our research. Because if you just change a law, if you took a law from Belgium and put it in Central Africa, I can guarantee it won't work, because that law was actually developed in Belgium, probably based on social contracts and social legitimacy there, that is not going to exist in Central Africa. But by the way, that's the history of colonization. I mean, we did that all the time. And so it's figuring out what that social legitimacy is, figuring out what the current legal legitimacy is, and then figuring out what is the right blend of the two. It's not necessarily finding what's socially legitimate and then just stamping law on it, because much of what's socially legitimate may not be at least consistent with our values around gender equality, for example. Here and then there.
So, in countries where, like, socially they operate more as a caste system, how are you able to overcome that barrier in order to secure land rights for people that are in impoverished areas?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, whether the caste system exists or such as in many places of the South Asia, or whether it's some other types of class stratification, that is always going to be a challenge, because but it's about how to say it. It's about identifying what are the needs, not just of the people at the bottom of that system, but understanding what are the kind of the needs and the power dynamics at the top of the system. Because if you don't understand all of it and kind of do a bit of a political economy analysis across it, you'll come up with a solution that will be totally unacceptable for people at the top. So changing these systems in the end often is a political question, and politics is the art of compromise. And we're often told we sell out, but our approach more is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And what we mean by that, don't let the perfect for the people at the bottom of that system be the enemy of something that is not quite as perfect but is good and would be acceptable to people at the top. It doesn't directly answer your question, but it's kind of suggests an approach.
My question also has to do with Fernando de Soto, and I'm wondering, because that book was written back in 2001, to what extent have you departed from his understanding? Like, what have you at Landesa added that you found that he missed or that he misunderstood?
Sure. Yeah, I know Hernando quite well, and he's been at Landesa several times. I've been at his Institute for Liberty and Democracy. So two things. I'll highlight. One is Hernando does not focus on those who are absolutely landless. He almost starts with the assumption that everyone has access or is using some land. You just have to formalize their rights to that land, and which I think misses the people at the very bottom, who I would say are absolutely landless. I also think Hernando oversells the collateral aspect of the benefit of getting land rights. There is some benefit there for sure, but on my list of what would be the most important benefits, it might make the top 10, but if it made the top 10, it would be barely. And he, I think, puts it up much higher, certainly in the top 3.
Sorry, if I could just follow up with that. So if he doesn't focus on the landless, how does Landesa focus on the landless? Does it focus on redistribution or some other form to address that problem?
The mode by which the landless get land is different things in different places. Redistribution certainly is part of it, but we would put a special focus on the landless in the field research that we're doing. Identifying who they are, what their problems are, what are the possible paths. So those paths can be redistribution, like distribution or giving excess land, whether that's government land or other land to them. It can be through land purchase programs. There's a number of ways. We tend not to go quickly to the kind of take from the rich, give to the poor approach, just because it's practically problematic. But having said that, you can use expropriation methods. So like the government in every country in the world has the power to take privately owned land for public purposes, right? I own a house in Seattle. If the government wants to build a school on my land, they can take it. And the basic idea behind that is one of eminent domain, and it's a social contract, is the government makes a decision on behalf of society that we have found a better use for your land. So you can use that same approach around redistributing land to poor people from rich people, but you got to make sure it includes notice and compensation.
When you're in discussions with the local government in maybe a more hostile area, do you discuss any sort of protection for those that receive land grants that may be subject to intimidation once they do receive them?
Yeah, well, we have to be mindful of that at all times to make sure that people are not being harmed or putting them in harm's way by giving them land. It actually comes up most often around advancing women's rights, and it's around but so yes, we do, and there's a number of ways in which we do that. But it's less of a problem for like poor people as a whole than you would think.
So obviously there's a lot of conflict, like interperson around land. How does Landesa approach like on the government level? Like, because you can make these kind of new laws and give people titles, but if you have a government that doesn't have a track record of like respecting laws long term, or there's shifts in power, how do they kind of formulate that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because it goes to kind of the rule of law. Is there some type of minimal level of rule of law? If there's not a minimal level of rule of law in a country, it's unlikely that Landesa will go there, frankly. So one way of looking at how we choose countries is we're looking at places where we've seen, based on our experience, where you see kind of preconditions for success, even though they haven't reached success there. If some of those preconditions are present, we will go there. But if it's a failed state, or a state that's in current like large-scale violent conflict, it's unlikely that we will go there.
So you just kind of like look for that basis already, not necessarily at steps to. You're not as focused on creating government atmosphere which will affect us, right? As much as seeking out governments that will that's your kind of.
Yeah, and it's not that we're not interested in it, but we realize our ability to influence that is limited really on what the government's doing around land. Having said that, we do give trainings for government officials and do a lot of other things that try to increase the government's capacity to enforce rights on land.
There is another class coming in, so I'll respect that. I want to thank Tim for his time. We have a small token.
Oh, thank you.
I don't know if Tim has a few minutes to hang around, but maybe we can have him in the lobby if there's a...
I'd be happy to.